Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this town hall event. I appreciate that you are all joining to discuss this very important topic, and I want to thank those who took the time to share their questions in advance. Today's discussion will examine sensitive topics, and I urge you to prioritize your well-being. If you're struggling with anything we talk about, please feel free to step away from this discussion or come back later. We will be recording and archiving this town hall for later viewing. And if you do need additional support, Compassionate Care is available through CAPS and the Employee Assistance Program. Sexual assault, misconduct, and harassment are complex national issues, especially on college campuses. There are no easy solutions to this issue, but our ambition is always to do better and continue to make progress. Penn State is deeply committed to fostering and sustaining a safe and supportive campus environment and holding accountable those who violate this fundamental expectation. When I became president in 2014, I established a task group to examine the critical issue of sexual misconduct on our campuses. The Sexual Assault Task Force developed 18 recommendations, all of which I accepted. Since that time, Penn State has made significant progress on those 18 measures. To highlight just a few, we hired a full-time Title IX coordinator, one of the core recommendations of the task group, and allocated financial resources to that office to implement a number of the other 17 recommendations. We improved the way we investigate and resolve sexual misconduct cases with the establishment of the Office of Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response, which investigates all allegations of sexual misconduct against students. The Office of Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response also now publishes an annual report that includes information on number of reports received, number of cases handled, type of behavior reported, incident locations, number of investigations conducted, type and percentage of resolutions, and other relevant data accessible to the community. The Office of Student Conduct strengthens sanctions for those who are found to be responsible. We've expanded our educational, prevention, and intervention program, as well as our support services for survivors. We improved mechanisms for reporting sexual misconduct, and we launched a climate survey to help us gather data on the scope of the problem on our campuses. However, despite these significant efforts, sexual assaults persist across the nation and, unfortunately, here at Penn State. This is a vexing issue that our nation has struggled with for decades. That brings me to the first question I would like to pose to our panel of participants. Have our efforts to prevent sexual misconduct in our community been unsuccessful, or have we made some progress, yet have more to do? There are no easy answers or solutions. So joining me today via Zoom to address this challenging topic are Susanna Dare, Associate Vice President for Affirmative Action, Stephanie Delaney, Executive Deputy Chief, University Police and Public Safety, Tamla Lewis, Associate General Counsel, Danny Shehay, Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs, Nora Van Horn, student in the Schreier Honors College and member of the Schreier Gender Equity Coalition, Yvette Wilson, Interim Director of the Gender Equity Center. I've shared many of the changes we have made since 2015. But before going into questions from the community, let's take a minute and discuss where we are today. Have we made progress in combating sexual misconduct on our campuses? Have we made it easier for students to report? Have we done a better job with education? How about supporting victims? What's working and what isn't working? So I would like to go around the room. But to begin, Suzanne, do you want to address this first?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Barron, for setting the stage for this important conversation today. And we have made significant progress, as you noted, institutionally around changes to our response to sexual misconduct, changes to our policies and our procedures. And some of those changes have been mandated by federal law, as folks know, and other changes have been made based on our own internal assessment of areas for needed improvement. Since the task force completed its work in 2015, as President Barron has noted, we appointed a full-time Title IX coordinator and established the Office of Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response, better known as OSIMPR to lots of folks who are listening. We've also developed a centralized online mechanism for reporting sexual misconduct, which is housed in OSIMPR. And we've made a number of improvements to our investigative process for student cases. So for instance, in 2015, we have gone from conducting investigations with no in-person testimony to 2016, where we introduced complainants and respondents into the hearing process so that there were in-person testimony, through to 2019, where we introduced witnesses for in-person testimony at our hearings. And so part of that was due to what we perceived as concerns raised by students who felt that there needed to be some additional improvements made in our investigative process. In 2018, we reorganized our structure for the Title IX program and once again increased the resources for the program to provide appropriate services across the university to parties who were impacted by sexual misconduct. And so the increase in resources resulted in additional staffing in both OSIMPR as well as in the Office of Affirmative Action, both around who conducts investigations and managing the caseload, which was something that we hadn't necessarily done before. As folks are aware, we have more recently overhauled our AD 85 policy, which is our Title IX policy, and it has policy and procedures. And we've made some revisions to policy AD 91, which is our overarching non-discrimination policy. Most of that was as a result of new federal regulations in August of 2020. And so we currently manage sexual misconduct allegations that are reported under AD 85 when they meet the criteria for Title IX conduct. And we manage current allegations for sexual misconduct when they are outside of that criteria. We manage those behaviors under policy AD 91. So effectively, we have two processes that we have here at the university. A number of other things we've done, we have continued to shorten the time frame for managing student and employee sexual misconduct cases, and that was a concern for folks. So we've tried really hard in the past several years to shorten the time for that. And we have moved our records to a centralized database. Previously, I see Danny shaking his head, previously we had several databases, and that was also something that we needed to work on. So we have certainly managed to create one database for all of our records for more organized and accurate record keeping, which is important. And then additionally, we've increased the amount of educational programming and training around sexual misconduct that's offered across the university. And then lastly, as President Barron noted, we introduced the Sexual Misconduct Climate Survey in 2015 with another iteration in 2018. And the next iteration to be conducted this spring, as a matter of fact. So that's important for gathering information about students' experiences and attitudes about sexual misconduct. And so we've made quite a bit of progress, actually, in the last 5 to 6, 7 years in this space for both students and employees, and hope to do more as we continue to assess our programs.
Danny, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Barron. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you to all of those who are watching or will watch this at a later point. I won't repeat, I'll try not to repeat what Susanna shared, but yes, I agree. We have made significant progress in many areas. One of those that I will highlight that Suzanne mentioned is the staffing of the Office of Student Misconduct or Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response. We have added a tremendous amount of resources. One reason for that is because all of the Commonwealth, so all campuses, the functions of OSIMPR serve all of the campuses. And so they investigate cases centrally. They provide resources and support working with Commonwealth campus folks to do that. but it's all centrally located. So we wanted to add a tremendous amount of resources to the office here at University Park to ensure that we could do that effectively and consistently across the campuses. So it's now staffed, fully staffed with a director, an associate director, an assistant director who has primary responsibility for interacting with the Commonwealth campuses and ensuring that students at those campuses get the support that they need, and we're responding as we should. And then we also have a case manager, and then we have 3 additional investigators as well. So it's a good sized staff. And that staff is dedicated to providing immediate and ongoing resources and support to those students who are impacted by sexual misconduct and sexual violence. And that includes providing informal resolution options where appropriate. All of our staff in OSIMPR are trained in restorative practices. It's not appropriate for all cases, but is appropriate for many. And many complainants, those who file reports, want to engage in those processes. So we have formalized that and continue to work to utilize restorative practices as best we can to address the harm that has been done by the behavior that students engaged in. I'd say a primary area in which we need to continue to improve is educating the campus community on what the university is doing. And I'll reference this later also. But we need to share with the university. We need to have more ongoing conversation with what is happening, what is not happening, and gathering feedback in more intentional ways, not just through the survey, but ongoing throughout the year. We also need to continue talking with students about what consent is and what it's not, but what consent is and what it looks like. Many of our cases on campus are around the issue of consent. And so we need to make sure that we're having that collective community conversation about that. And then we need to continue to engage students at all levels of the college experience, not just as they enter the university, but throughout their time here. And then one thing, although we as administrators and staff may believe that we are doing a lot of work around education and training, and I do think that that is true, it is very concerning to us collectively that the 2018 data indicate that depending on the demographic of the respondent to the survey, to the climate survey, and the type of information that it was addressing, that at its best, only 72% of those who responded believed that they had received written information about sexual misconduct policies at the university, and at its worst in that section, 24%. So there's a lot of work to do around getting information into the hands of students in a way that they receive it and acknowledge it and understand it.
Nora.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Barron, and thank you for having me participate in this really important dialogue. Thank you to those students and faculty who have worked in coalition with me, not just in preparing for this town hall, but throughout the last few years. I've been asked to offer the student perspective, and so that's what I aim to do today. And within that, I think that students believe that there's a difference with the university being compliant and doing what's best for students. I've heard students believe that the university is not doing all that it can, and that historically the university has not been a leader. That being said, I think students are really hopeful. Students also believe that the university has an opportunity to leverage this moment to become a leader. But to do that, the university needs to make 3 key changes. And so first, I think that the university must define sexual violence correctly. Sexual violence is a manifestation of structural problems like sexism and the normalization of violence, particularly violence against marginalized groups. These structural problems are embedded in Penn State's culture. They must take accountability for this and stop framing sexual and relationship violence as an interpersonal and inevitable issue. There will always be creeps is not an adequate excuse for a lack of action. The University of Michigan has done this recently by establishing a working group on culture change. The second thing that students believe that the university must do is the university leadership must invest in true prevention efforts. We need to use peer-reviewed educational efforts aimed at preventing sexual violence. We need to assess and analyze educational outcomes. Currently, students believe that we're not doing neither adequately. They also believe that the university is not adequately investing in prevention efforts. In fact, from my knowledge and from a lot of students' knowledge, OSIMPR does not employ anyone to specifically do prevention efforts. Prevention efforts are thus they fall on the Gender Equity Center, which students believe is understaffed and underfunded, although through no fault of those who work there. Michigan State, in contrast, employs 10 full-time staff to do sexual violence prevention, outreach, and education efforts. We have 1 staff member who does this work part-time. The last thing that Penn State needs to do, or that students believe that Penn State needs to do, is be more transparent with and accountable to students. To address sexual violence, we must first understand how the issue occurs at our university. However, the 2018 survey report was released just a month ago, and much pertinent and valuable information that the university collected was not disclosed in the public 2018 survey report. In contrast, our peer institution, Ohio State, completes campus climate surveys every year, including the national AAU survey, and does not selectively release data as we do. Sexual violence is preventing as this really vexing issue, but ultimately it's not. We need to listen to the experts, we need to invest in prevention, and we need to increase university transparency and accountability. Students believe that this will lead to better outcomes, and I do too.
Thank you. Yvette.
Thank you, everyone. Obviously, this is a very complex issue. I do believe we have made a lot of progress over these past few years, as Suzanne summarized very well in detail. Some of the changes we've made over the past, specifically for our office and where we're involved, include CARSVA, the Coalition Against Relationship and Sexual Violence. That committee has begun meeting again, and we've also established a new subcommittee that is specifically looking at the 2018 data and what recommendations we can make going forward with that. We have new members on that committee, including faculty and staff as well from across the Commonwealth. And that's really important if we're going to get as much input and buy-in on this as we can going forward. Secondly, we are in the process of hiring new staff at our office. We're hiring for the first time ever a full-time survivor advocate. So we will have, whereas right now it's myself and the assistant director who meet with students, we will now have a full-time staff position dedicated to meeting with students who've experienced different forms of violence. And we're also in the process of hiring a full-time prevention educator as well, in addition to the assistant director and myself. We also have done 2 different It's On Us grants over the past few years. One with the Office of Sexual Misconduct in translating some of the video education programs we do into different languages. So students whose primary language isn't English can learn easier about what this is all about, what the expectations are, and what assistance there is if something should happen to them. Our office is currently working through an It's On Us grant that specifically works on issues around different marginalized groups as well. And we're also looking at providing advisors for students. As Suzanne was stating, with the changes in the investigation module for these cases, what we've seen in the past is oftentimes complainants don't have an advisor. And so that's something really important where we're trying to recruit and train new people who can not just adequately help a complainant going through that process, but really help them, be that support and be that advisor for them. We also have an anonymous reporting option, which is absolutely critical for folks that don't feel comfortable providing their name, but they want to report the incident. And then we're also continuing to collaborate with all of our local entities, our service providers, Center Safe, different law enforcement agencies and such. And that's critical in doing this work and moving forward. Thank you.
Tamla.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Barron, for having me here. I would just add to what Yvette and others have said. From a legal perspective, in working through the new Title IX regulations last year, as many people know, there was a big revision to Title IX in May of last year, implementation in August of 2020. So in the midst of, pandemic and returning to campus and doing all of that work, we also worked very diligently in updating our policies and procedures with regard to Title IX. I'll speak a bit more later in detail on what some of those changes were, but we did want to not only meet the letter of the law and what the requirements were, but we wanted to go above and beyond for Penn State with regard to what was required. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I just wanted to point out that in addition to what the requirements are, we have done, a lot of due diligence in reaching even beyond what those requirements are to make sure that our students and employees feel safe.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie.
Thank you, Dr. Barron, for having me, and I appreciate being on this panel. From the law enforcement perspective, it's important that we have been focusing on engagement with our community. We know traumatic events are very hard to be reported to law enforcement. So we are trying to start the engagement process with our students in non-crisis situations So partnering with our students through our community education programs is one of the main things I think we've made some progress on over the years. To foster, additionally, to foster some reporting mechanisms, we've had online mechanisms for those who report, are also anonymous, because we know law enforcement perspective, the uniform is very intimidating for people to come forward and to report. So we're really trying to foster a more welcoming reporting mechanism for students. We've also fostered advanced training for our officers. We know just going to the police academy is not enough. Making sure that we're along with best practices, making sure our training, not only our line officers, but also our investigative processes, making sure we're trauma informed, making sure we're sensitive to victims. So that process, though traumatic for law enforcement, is as comfortable as it can be moving forward. We couldn't do this alone. We're just a piece of the puzzle in the university when it comes to sexual assaults. So partnering and collaborating with a lot of the folks on the panel and student affairs partners is really important to us. We will continue to foster those relationships and collaborations with a lot of the people on this panel, and I'll talk about that more in a little while.
Well, thank you, and thank you for setting the stage of what we are doing and things that we need to do better. All the remaining questions are ones that have been posed by our community, so I'm going to make sure that I read each one of them and then refer it to our panel members. So the first question is, and many of the questions submitted asked about our culture. One question reads, current efforts to reduce sexual violence are focused on individuals. What will the university do to change the culture at Penn State? And Danny, and then Yvette, if you would share your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Barron. In order to change a culture, I will say that individuals at all levels of the university need to be involved. So education of and involvement by individuals at all levels of the university are critical in combating sexual harassment and assault. We continue to try to create a culture of reporting, support, and trust in university processes and response. And we collaborate with both our on-campus partners, students, faculty, staff, other units across the university to do so. And then also with our community partners, with State College Police, with local advocacy offices and units. And we still need to do more in that arena. We're always striving to do more, but we need to one of the things we need to do is keep this conversation prominent and continue, as Yvette mentioned, utilize mechanisms and avenues like CARSVA to continue to engage partners across the community to ensure that we're addressing this as best we can. Yvette?
Yeah, absolutely, Danny. And thank you, Dr. Barron. This is a complex issue nationally. It's not just here at Penn State. It affects every college, every society, all over the country, all over the world. And education is critical on this. As Nora was saying, we need impactful, we need relevant and ongoing education, evidence-based, so we can learn by the experts who have done this in the past, what has worked and what will work going forward. But we also need a culture change, and that's going to take time. There may never be a perfect solution on this. However, we do need our actions as we're moving forward to not just be on the response, but also to be on the prevention, on the proactive education component, engagement, where everybody is working on this issue. And all of our efforts have to also address and take into consideration different communities that might be affected by these types of crimes and incidents differently, such as our trans community, our LGBT people of color, because when you start building those different identities on top of issues, it makes it even more complex. So we have to look at this really carefully and come up with the best solution based on evidence going forward.
Thank you. One of our submitted questioners asks why the university has fallen short in our pledge to be a leader in sexual misconduct prevention. As we have noted, we have many prevention measures in place and are always looking to do more. So why does sexual assault and misconduct continue? Yvette, perhaps you'd like to give your thoughts.
Sure. This is actually something I get asked pretty often by students, faculty, a lot of people. I wouldn't say we've fallen short. As Suzanne has stated, we've made a lot of changes over these past few years, and those have been really good changes. We have new members, we have that new subcommittee, we have new positions, new grants to address issues when we see shortfalls, and we try to address it, come up with the best solution. Doing intersectional primary education programs so that we can address those, anonymous reporting, collaborating with our victim service providers. We have great relationships with Center Safe. Our staff and their staff do events together all the time, local law enforcement, and that's so critical in moving forward on this. Why does it continue? Perpetrators in the end are those responsible for sexual assault and all of these types of incidents. It's never the victim's responsibility. And sometimes, unfortunately, these perpetrators have this strong sense of entitlement where they use power and control over another person to commit these acts. Oftentimes it's men. We know historically that's the majority of perpetrators, although anybody is and has been a perpetrator. But it's people, kind of what Nora was saying earlier, where people adhere to these rigid gender roles, men over women. And that just continues in this culture. We need to, if we're ever going to change this, we need to really look at the inequality of women in our society, because if that continues to allow, again, traditionally men to basically get away with this against women. Further, various communities have become more visible. I already talked about, LGBT folks and people of color. We need to address those issues as we're moving forward, because different populations have this affecting them differently. If somebody is an immigrant, for example, they might be in fear of reporting for fear of maybe being deported. So there's so many different issues that can come into play here. And so we have to look at that. This whole rape culture, we've heard about what is rape culture, how does that play into this? And it's things such as jokes and comments, sexual harassment, those types of victim blaming statements. When we basically turn our head away or ignore those kinds of statements when they're made, we're not taking that opportunity to address it. A lot of people like to use the phrase calling people out. I really like to refer to it, as a colleague said, calling people in, and take that opportunity as a bystander to address the issue, let them know why that is not appropriate, why that is a victim blaming statement, whatever it might be, and then move on. So hopefully you can use that as a teaching moment. We also have data from not only our survey, but there's other data out there. The AAU data that I was recently reviewing shows that one of the biggest reasons that survivors won't even access services that are available to them is because they feel that sexual assault is not a big deal. I mean, that's a horrible stance to take, or they don't have physical injuries. If it's something that's without consent, there may not be physical injuries. And so we need to really look at what, like Nora was saying, what is the definition of sexual assault and sexual misconduct, and what does that actually look like in reality? So, and then beyond that, we need to educate on consent. And consent is such a basic understanding that everybody really does have, but they don't really know that when they're in these such situations. It's a basic skill. If somebody can order a pizza with their friends, what kind of pizza do you want? What toppings do you want on your pizza? You know how to engage in consent. It's just a conversation. No is obviously not consent. Silence is not consent. Coercion is not consent. And so we really need to address the basics of consent and let everybody know that they have the skills to do this, and they need to do that in order to respect each other as citizens and as people in the community here at Penn State.
Well, thank you. We're getting many questions asking if Penn State is doing enough to protect students. In particular, one question asks, what will you be doing to stop sexual assault on our campus? And I must admit, I've been guilty of the wrong answer to this particular question, because I go, stop all sexual assault. There'll always be creeps. It's exactly what Nora just said. And really, that isn't the answer. The answer is we have to do better. We have to do more. But let's listen to the answer to this question directly from a student's perspective and have Nora come back on. And Stephanie and Yvette, maybe if you could add to it after Nora speaks.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Barron. So from the student perspective, sexual violence is a devastating issue. Of course, students want to be involved in creating solutions. However, if students aren't invited to participate in conversations about Penn State's culture and policy, students will be prevented from contributing to real changes. Right now, students are encouraged to participate in bystander intervention training, host anti-sexual violence programming with Stand for State, or attend town hall meetings like this one. This is a great start, but students perceive, and rightly so, that sexual violence is a systemic and cultural issue. We can't just expect students to just do programming and attend events. We need more transparency and accountability from the institution. And students need to have a say in how many and where resources are being devoted. Without this, the responsibility continues to be put on individual unpaid student volunteers and survivor victims themselves, and it hides a larger culture that allows and encourages sexual violence. Current efforts focus on preventing sexual assault happening between two adults in private and without a cultural or systemic lens. Unfortunately, this isn't the reality of sexual violence, and I think that we can be doing more to enable students to combat the issue as it exists.
Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. On a law enforcement perspective, it's really important to report. We want to hold perpetrators accountable, but we can't do this alone. It is really traumatic and really hard for folks to report to law enforcement. And so having those networks and resources available to students to report the crime so we can properly address those issues is key for us. So we will continue to work on the engagement piece, really starting to break down the barriers for law enforcement in our community. That's an issue in itself, but trying to make an environment where people feel more safe reporting to law enforcement is something that we need to work on to make this a safe space for students to report. Also, it's a community issue, as Nora and Yvette already said. This isn't just victims and survivors. This is all of us. It's in it together to make it change and to support our community as a whole. We also want to make sure, again, I'm going to throw out the safe reporting mechanisms. We can't do this alone. We want to make sure that students do feel safe reporting. Thank you.
Yvette.
Thank you. I'm just briefly going to add, I really do believe that ongoing education is the key here. And when I say ongoing, I don't mean just one and you're done. You know, we do this for new students coming in, and then we have follow-ups if people decide to participate. Well, throwing out another example out there, Michigan State requires education every year of all 4 years. This is such an important and critical topic. We need to do that. How can we expect students to remember this information if we give it to them one time at the beginning of their first year, and then we expect them to remember it and apply it and know how it works for the rest of their 4 years? It's just critical that we do ongoing, relevant, appropriate education. And it needs to be also specific for different groups that we work with, whether it's athletics, residence life, fraternity, sorority life, all the different groups that we've talked about today. And then, like others have said, we have to see the buy-in, we have to see the resources, we have to see a university-wide commitment to this from everybody, from athletics to res life, all of us. We have the right and the obligation to become a leader on this issue. And if we can do a lot of positive change here and really make a difference for our students.
Okay, next, the question is, what do you think the university is doing well, and where do you think there is room for progress? And we've already addressed a part of this in the introduction, but maybe we could hit some of the most important points on what we're doing well and what we need to improve. Big topic, but Suzanne and then Danny.
Thank you, Dr. Barron. I think one of the things that we have done well is listen to student and employee feedback, feedback from complainants and respondents around procedures and policies for responding to sexual misconduct. We've got some work to do in other areas, but certainly we have heard what folks had to say and what folks thought needed to be improved in terms of the kinds of mechanisms that we put in place for responding to allegations of misconduct. And so I do think we've done a really great job on that, and there's certainly more improvement that we could be making. As we've noted earlier, I think we have done a really good job with trying to increase the resources around staffing and be a little bit more targeted. So for instance, when it was clear to us that we needed more assistance on the campuses outside of University Park with trying to manage cases at those campuses, we understood that we had to shift our staffing and put some more focus on case management for the campuses outside of University Park. I think Danny will probably talk more about our respondent support position, understanding that we had some areas that we still had gaps in and that we needed to address. One of the areas that I think we have done well in as we are developing or have recently developed is our new assessment program for our Title IX program, and that launches this year. We are in the process of launching that. We've not had a formalized assessment mechanism or program for Title IX. So that's really important for us to launch so that we can determine more formally whether our procedures and policies and efforts are actually effective. And are they accomplishing what we have set out to accomplish? That said, I'm actually going to echo Nora in a number of the things that she pointed out around what we need to do better. And one of those areas is clearly improving our data analysis and dissemination. We have fallen short on it. We know that we've got work to do and have just not made as much progress in that area. And we recognize that that leaves the community feeling incredibly uninformed. So we know that we need to do a better job and access and collect data and disseminate it, analyze it so that we can determine what are the patterns, what are the trends around this space. For instance, how do we make sure that we assess the effectiveness of the kinds of mechanisms and structures that we have in place? How do we communicate more effectively that information across the university so that people understand what's actually happening and where we need more improvement? And how do we benchmark against our peers? We've heard a lot about that from both Nora and Yvette. We need to do a better job with that, and we can't do that without having sufficient data and without analyzing that data and without disseminating that data. It makes it difficult. One of the concerns that we continue to hear, for instance, is that there's an increase in sexual misconduct reports. It's important for us to note that we need to determine whether there's an actual increase in sexual misconduct or is there an increase in the reporting of behavior, and that there isn't necessarily an increase in behavior. We need to use data to make that determination. Let's be clear, we need people to report, as Stephanie said. We can't address the behavior if we don't know where it's happening, when it's happening, and how it's happening. And so that's really critical. I think we've done a good job with trying to streamline how people report and trying to communicate how folks report. But it's important that we note that more reporting is actually a positive, not more behavior, but more reporting is actually what we want to see. And so we've made some efforts there, but we need to move further in that space as well. And then I think the amount of programming and education that we've certainly moved on that. We've certainly made progress. We have not made nearly enough progress. As Nora pointed out, there are a number of areas that we still have work to do around our education and programming, particularly around the cultural climate, right? And what this means, not on an individual level, as Nora and others have pointed out. And then clearly increasing the staffing also, which has been pointed out. We've got more work to do and more staffing that we need to add and more resources that we need to put forward.
Danny.
Good, thank you. I'll just add a couple of additions to what Suzanne mentioned. While we have made significant improvements in recent years in the student conduct and investigations model, there's more work to be done even there, whether it's panel training or how we support students through it. And although we do provide, I feel confident that we provide a high level of support for complainants and respondents through the process, but we have added some things like in addition to the work that gender equity does and other advocacy units do in supporting complainants, we did create the respondent support coordinator position to support respondents. We realize it can be traumatic to be accused and to go through the process. And we want students on all sides to understand the rights in the process, the options they have available to them, and what the process and procedures will look like. We also continue, I alluded to before, we continue to look at restorative practices options and how to best address harms when they're done and educate students through the process while holding them appropriately accountable. And then a final area of improvement I'll mention is that we need to more proactively share the work of the university and what we are doing and updates along the way. Not wait for every 3 years when the survey results are announced, but really share along the way the progress we're making, what updates we're making as a result of feedback we receive. And we need to make sure that we have the appropriate structures in place to create and facilitate that communication.
Thank you. One of the other things that that one of the individuals has, or maybe more individuals have asked about, is the fact that we have this changing landscape federally. And so to answer the specific question, maybe Tamla and Danny could ask, where do we stand now in terms of federal guidance and what we're doing? Tamla?
Okay. Well, I'll take that one. Thank you, Dr. Barron. So it's funny, I had my notes here and I was going to just rely on my notes, but I'm actually going to respond to just some of the comments that were made by the other panelists. The new regulations as of last year were, well over 2,000 pages. So I don't have the time now to really do a decent breakdown of what a lot of those changes were. So I'll just address some of the changes that we've made in response to some of the comments that have been made. Nora, I appreciate your perspective on talking about education. I think Yvette as well. I think it's important to point out education for students and employees on our process is wonderful. We need to do that. But we've also included education for our decision makers. I think it's very important that we have posted our trainings and things like that on our websites. But beyond that, we are having continuing education for those who are in a position to make decisions. So we are educating have a mixed gender 3-person panel for every one of our live hearings. So it's very important for them to be educated on consent. I think someone mentioned that. What is consent? What does that look like? How do we judge that? How do we make that determination? We train them as well on credibility. What's the preponderance of evidence? What's more likely than not to have occurred? These are lay people. So it's very important for us to not just educate the community, but make sure that we're educating our decision makers on our new processes and our new procedures as well. Also, I did want to point out a recent change to our Title IX regulations involves the addition of gender identity and sexual orientation as a form of sex discrimination. So we have updated our 8085, which is the Title IX policy. We've updated that to reflect that federal change as well. In addition, I wanted to mention when I said that we have kind of met the letter of the law, but we're doing as much as we can beyond that. We have provided attorney for students. If we have two parties, I won't even say students, but just parties in a case. If one party has an attorney, the university will pay for an attorney for the other party to try to alleviate or mitigate as much inequity as we possibly can. That's not something that's required, but that is something that we have made an effort to do. In addition, the new Title IX regulations narrowed the definition of behaviors that fell under Title IX. In response to that, we expanded our non-discrimination policy under 8091 because even if a sexual harassment case does not rise to the level of, quote, Title IX, we wanted to make sure that we had processes and procedures in place that we could still address those behaviors as well. So we wanted to make sure that nothing was slipping through the cracks. I think Dr. Barron mentioned it's not foolproof, but we're doing as much as we can to mitigate, any of these instances, to educate as much as we can. I'm always working with Suzanne and Danny and others and collaborating from a legal perspective in what we can do to mitigate as much risk as we possibly can.
So we have a lot of questions left and less time than we need. So I'm just going to go straight to the next one. What locations or types of locations on Penn State campuses are associated with sexual assault? And Danny, perhaps you could answer that question.
Thank you, Dr. Barron. It's really, sexual assault and sexual harassment is really not isolated to any one location or type of location at a university. It really can and does happen anywhere. And it's important to note that while Title IX was curtailed in recent guidance to specific geographic areas involving specific demographics of students, Penn State remains committed to continuing to address sexual assaults and sexual harassment wherever it may occur. Penn State has a pretty liberal off-campus misconduct policy also, so it's important to note that we don't just address violations that occur on campus or behaviors that happen on campus, but we work closely with community partners to address those violations as well, both through policy, and we do that through policy, as Suzanne mentioned before. 8085 covers Title IX, but 8091 covers other violations that may not fall under Title IX specifically. And then I'll just say, while it can happen anywhere, as I think Yvette and maybe Nora mentioned earlier, we need to, though, identify there are areas that are prone where students are gathering, bars, restaurants, or bars, apartments, fraternities, where there's a gathering or consorting of students together, and where substances and alcohol may play a part, but also where there's there's research on single-sex organizations, whether it is fraternities or a militaristic organization like an ROTC or other groups, athletic teams. We need to focus our education and intervention efforts specifically there more than we're doing now, although I'll mention some of what we're doing in some of those areas in a minute.
Thank you. Speaking of crowds, one person asked specifically, Beaver Stadium and steps the university asks a particular question about Beaver Stadium and steps the university is taking to keep fans, particularly students, safe in a football crowd. So Stephanie, could you share some thoughts there?
Sure. Unfortunately, we have had an increase of incidents at Beaver Stadium, particularly inside the stadium around the student section. Some of the mitigation efforts we've launched as a result of that is we've had increased police presence, particularly in the student section. That's for a couple of reasons. One is a deterrent and preventative mechanism, so people can see us, know that we're paying attention, hopefully be a deterrent of that behavior, but also as a resource and accessibility to our students so they know exactly where to go and can report timely. So that is twofold. We're also focusing on communication and connection with the other staff at the stadium, such as ushers and other security staff within the stadium that work game days. That communication around involves us alerting them of these concerns that we have inside the stadium so that they're aware. They're really our eyes and ears out there. So if they are aware of the situations, can keep an eye out and know how to report to us timely, that's important to us. So we want to address these concerns in a timely fashion. And also, if there is a situation that rises to the level, we have been launching a timely warning for those cases, and we've done that this season, unfortunately.
Thank you. What security measures does Penn State plan to put into place, particularly for student dorms and on-campus live-in, given that most sexual assaults are reported as occurring in those locations? So Danny and then Stephanie.
Thank you. There have always been processes and protocols in place in on-campus living facilities, both at University Park and at the campuses, whether it be access controls, RA and professional staff presence, educational programming and on-call responsibilities. However, of course, we can always do more. It's important to note that we often see increased reports in the areas for which we have more responsibility because the reporting options are familiar and more easily accessible, for example, with the RAs or coordinators or even university police.
Okay. Stephanie.
I've said this before, but our partnerships and relationships, particularly with residence life staff, those who are involved in the living and culture of our students, really makes a difference in how we can respond. The comfort level and the connections that we have with our partners in residence life is really important to us. And so again, the reporting, the education, all the things that we just mentioned are really important to our success.
One of our submitted questions asked, to what degree is underage drinking associated with sexual assault at Penn State? I would broaden that question and not limit it to underage drinking, but rather how much of a role does alcohol play in sexual assaults? So Nora and then Stephanie, if you would share your thoughts.
Absolutely. So that's it's a common question. And from the student perspective, the connection between alcohol and sexual assault is that alcohol is used as a date rape drug. Of course, students are drinking at Penn State, Penn State is recognized as a party school. It is advertised as a party school. And what is an acceptable consequence of drinking? You know, if I go out to country night at Pickles with my friends, what do I deserve? You know, maybe I forget to submit an assignment that's due at midnight. Maybe I wake up in the morning with a hangover. But ultimately, drinking too much might lead to a hangover, but it does not lead to sexual assault. The fact that alcohol is used as a date rape drug is often not talked about. Perpetrators of sexual assault use alcohol to change victims' perceptions of their surroundings, and perpetrators are more likely to assault people when they themselves are drinking. Sexual assault is not a natural consequence of drinking, even if we talk about it like it is. This is a way to suggest that students should mitigate drinking to avoid being assaulted. And unfortunately, I've seen this personally at the institution many times. When I came into the institution as a first-year student, I took the Safe and Aware training. And one of the screens that was shared with me listed the health-related consequences of high-risk drinking. And they were blacking out and a series of other alcohol-related consequences. But one of the health-related consequences they listed was sexual assault. In the 2015 task force report that's been cited a few times, alcohol is mentioned on page 5. On page 5, it's talked about how often victims are drinking when they are assaulted. In that same report, rape culture is not mentioned at all. Sexism is not mentioned at all. And some of the other correlates that we've talked about, i.e. culture, were not mentioned in an adequate way. Similarly, the sexual misconduct surveys that the university performs will ask questions about how much drinking has occurred around the incident and publish that information, but don't publish other pertinent data. For example, the location or which groups perpetrators belong to. This is why, and I believe it was a vet that noted this, but this is why students feel like when they're assaulted, it's not really a big deal because they're told that they deserve it. And students don't deserve that. Ultimately, sexual violence and alcohol are not inherently connected. Like hazing, sexual violence is a result of interpersonal violence, power, and structural issues, even if alcohol is present. And from the student perspective, a lot of students believe that alcohol contributes to sexual violence because it absolves the university of accountability by providing a boogeyman to blame.
Stephanie, perhaps from a police perspective.
Unfortunately, oftentimes alcohol is related to sexual assaults, whether it's one, both, or all parties involved when reported. One thing that's important to remember is I really don't want students to deter reporting because alcohol is involved. We have immunity laws in place in Pennsylvania. We also know that the safety of the victim survivor is priority, the safety of our community. And I never want alcohol, whether underage or otherwise, be a deterrent for reporting sexual assaults to us.
Okay, continuing on this theme, another question submitted asks about drug use leading to sexual assaults in our Greek community. What is being done to reduce drug and alcohol use that seems to be a factor in some of these assaults? How is the university holding Greek houses responsible for their illegal underage partying? The writer of the question contends that the actual number of these assaults is way higher than being reported. So Stephanie and then Danny, can you comment on these questions and your thoughts?
Sure. Similar to the previous question, alcohol and drugs often are one-on-one and involved, whether it's sexual assault, whether voluntary, involuntary, or unknown, involved in sexual assault and violent crimes. So we need to address all of that, both alcohol and drugs, as we respond as a university. As Nora said, the culture and the feedback. Important from the law enforcement perspective is drugs are illegal in Pennsylvania. So we need to know what's happening in our community, be connected and engaged with all areas, whether on or off campus, to make sure that we're addressing those concerns and needs and being reported using the anonymous mechanisms, because this can be sometimes very intimidating and scary to report such activity. But in order to address it, we need to know about it.
Good, and I'll add, we also in the university conduct processes and sexual misconduct processes mirror the Commonwealth's immunity for those who may have been violating the law or policy related to alcohol. We do not want that to be a deterrent. and we will not hold students accountable for that. We want them to come forward. I also want to say I agree with everything Nora said about alcohol and sexual assault, and someone who is consuming alcohol, a natural consequence of that is not sexual assault. It is very difficult, though, at the university to extract one conversation from the other when the majority, as Stephanie alluded to, the majority of what we see of the reports that come in are related to issues of consent. And where consent, where that becomes somewhat difficult at times is while someone who's incapacitated cannot give consent, when there are gradations of intoxication, then it becomes trying to figure out how much did a person get consent? Did another person reasonably believe they had consent? And what the actual events entailed. And that becomes the difficult challenge for the investigators to parse out and panels to determine where consent was. So we need to continue to do a better job. Again, what I mentioned at the beginning, educating the community on what consent is. And unless a person knows that they are 100% confident that they have knowing, clear, verbal, continuing consent, then they need to not engage in sexual interaction with another person. So unless that person knows that, then they need to not engage. And that's where substance abuse or alcohol use makes things unclear. So my strong encouragement to all of the community is unless you know that, and unless you know that you're not under the influence, someone else isn't, then don't assume ever that you have consent. Make sure that you have 100% knowing, verbal, clear, sober consent that's continuing to engage. Related to the fraternity and sorority community, specifically to that, with the advent of the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Compliance back in 2017, and the education, prevention, and oversight efforts of both that office, as well as the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Life, as well as others, we continue to discourage and address dangerous drinking, and while encouraging safer environments through both our monitoring efforts, our education efforts, but then also our accountability efforts. The Office of Student Conduct back in 2017 also assumed responsibility for organizational misconduct, not only focused on fraternities and sororities, but they're included. And so any violations that may be reported by the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Compliance or in Life, they're reported to Student Conduct. Student Conduct then investigates those and holds both organizations and individuals accountable. And importantly, and lastly, we require all prospective new members, so those who want to join the community, the Fraternity and Sorority Life community, as well as those who become new members, we require education and training for all of those. So either before they join or in their first semester of joining on alcohol, sexual assault, hazing, but we require that they go through significant training. But where we need to do better is continuing, as Yvette alluded to earlier, continuing to require that training throughout a student's experience at Penn State, not just in their first semester or before they join the community.
Thank you. Continuing a bit on this theme, we've received many questions about why the number of sexual assaults on campus appear higher this semester. One question states, "This is unacceptable. Why are there so many?" So perhaps Danny and then Suzanne for further thoughts.
Thank you. Yes, we remain concerned and we are very aware of the reports that come in. And as Suzanne mentioned before, we are constantly trying to determine, is this because we have better and easier reporting mechanisms or because there are more incidents? It's hard to compare this year's with last year's because COVID did alter the landscape, the number of students who were present, who were congregating, that sort of thing. But we do try to compare it with previous years. And so we're continuing to try to evaluate why the numbers do seem, I think, somewhat elevated compared to previous years, but trying to understand better why that is a difficult process, but we are engaged in that.
Suzanne?
I would agree with that, actually. And I think, it's important to note that we share the frustration. We share the frustration of folks. When we think about the fact that when we hear all of these reports, it seems as if all of the efforts that we have put in place are simply not effective. And so we are frustrated as well. And it's difficult to change behavior, individual level behavior, culture and climate, as we've talked about. I think, as Danny pointed out, it's really important for us to make sure that we're putting more emphasis on data collection and data analysis so that we can determine what the actual patterns and trends are. We've certainly talked about it from year to year, but we have not, we haven't done a deeper dive, quite frankly, into what that data actually looks like and what it actually means, and then how we take that information and inform strategies, policies, initiatives that need to be implemented as a result of that data. So that is an area that we are committed to continuing to work on and committed to communicating that data then. And as we said, we understand that people feel uninformed about what's actually happening. And we know that we've got to step up our game to make sure that we provide that data, collect it, analyze it, and then provide it so that we can determine necessary next steps.
So two related questions. How is Penn State using data such as these to prevent sexual assault? And how will you update or use the next survey to continue to better understand and address sexual assault? So why don't we just flip the order, but the same two speakers, Suzanne and Danny.
Thanks. So we are clear that we've tried to ask for, and partly in response to concerns that we didn't have enough student input in the previous iterations of the sexual misconduct climate surveys. And so we have tried to take steps this year to make sure that we have more student input, in part because folks need to understand what data that survey provides for us, what data we can actually mine from the survey and from the results, and how we use that. Part of what Yvette, I think, spoke about, and Nora as well, is what are the impacts of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct on particular populations, particularly marginalized populations. And we need to do a better job of sort of excavating that from the sexual misconduct survey, certainly to figure out where we need to go, what steps we need to put in place, and what kinds of resources and support we need to put in place for marginalized populations and certainly others, right? I mean, it's not simply marginalized populations, but we know we've got to pay some attention to those particular groups. I think in terms of the assessment that we are launching, the more formal assessment of our overall Title IX program, what's important there is for us to be able to take a better look and determine, whether our complaints are being routed appropriately, for instance. Do we have timelines for our cases that are actually appropriate and adequate? Do we have investigations that are following established procedures? Is there effective communication with parties involved? All of those are areas that we have built into this more formal assessment. And it's necessary for us to implement that assessment and then share that data so that we leave this community updated and informed about where we are and what work we have to do in that area.
And in the interest of time, I'll just add a couple of things. In order to be sure that we're employing student feedback and community feedback and creating and designing the next survey, we held a couple of focus groups. One with student leaders that we invited specific student leaders into, and then another it was an open invite to the campus community. So we gathered some valuable feedback from those. And we also created a website that was open until the end of October for community members to provide feedback about the survey. And the Student Affairs Research and Assessment Office, as well as Suzanne's office in Title IX, I've expressed and are committed to responding to the community to indicate what changes came about as a result of that feedback, and then making the appropriate modifications. So more to come on that.
So one person adds to that, and also how does this use of the survey in making changes align with the governor's recent proposed legislation, re It's On Us? Yvette, I think you've spent some time looking at the proposed legislation, so perhaps you would comment.
Absolutely. So for the It's On Us legislation, there are actually two main parts to that. One is a proposal of an affirmative consent definition for all of the universities in the state. And really, we have that already in our AD 85 policy, where we define consent very explicitly. Consent is a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity. Silence alone is not consent. If there's incapacitation or coercion, then it's not consent. So we have a very good, very specific definition. So I believe we've already met that with regards to that proposed legislation. The second part of it is proposing to strengthen the protections for victims of on-campus crimes by requiring the schools to inform victims of their rights. We've been doing that for many years, and that's something that I know we do very well. We notify them of their rights in person. We do it electronically when a report is made. The information is shared at different tabling events or educational events that we do. And this is one of the areas where we've touched on before with previous It's On Us grant, where we actually translated those materials into 6 different languages. So folks where English was not their first language, they could better understand what their rights are. So I believe we are doing very well on those areas.
Okay, so there is a great deal of interest about consent and how Penn State educates students about consent. So Nora, perhaps you could give us student perspective, and then Yvette defining what consent means.
Yes, I would love to give a student perspective. So the students believe that education about consent is important, but it must be complemented by other educational efforts too, and that Penn State can do this better. And so students, again, believe that there are 2 major issues why consent education by itself isn't enough. First, focusing on individual instances of sexual violence via consent without providing an interrogation of cultural norms reinforces the idea that sexual violence is an individual and not a cultural problem. Peer-reviewed research actually reveals that there's a relatively high incidence rate of consensual but unwanted sex among adolescent and adult women. So some studies indicate that as many as 50% of adolescent and adult women have consented to unwanted sex. So conversations that end at consent fail to realize that there are cultural and social dimensions that coerce students, particularly historically marginalized groups of students, to consent to sex. It also fails to acknowledge that respect of minoritized groups like women is absent in our community. Some individuals don't care about the pleasure or the safety of their partner. And sometimes this results in illegal sexual violence, and sometimes it doesn't. But either way, I don't think it's okay. Secondly, consent is a skill. Consent is based on communicating, as Yvette used with the pizza analogy earlier in our conversation. It's based on communicating with someone that you're in a sexual relationship with. We can't just have an orientation mentor pull up a slide with a fun acronym and move past it quickly. There are cultural influences that make many perpetrators, in fact, of sexual violence think that sexual violence is the same thing as sex. And as I noted earlier, OSEMPAR has no prevention efforts, and the Gender Equity Center, a lot of students believe, is understaffed and underfunded. So right now with consent, we're really meeting legal obligations, not helping to change the culture and incidence of sexual violence. And I believe, and students believe, that if we want a different type of town hall next year, we have to devote resources for students to practice consent and interrogate our cultural norms. In fact, our peer institution, University of Pittsburgh, in 2019, after their 2019 AAU survey came out, allocated $300,000 in grants to researchers and community members to develop new solutions to tackle sexual violence. We can do this too. We have to implement evidence-based practices that work, that our own students and faculty actually have expertise in, and commit the resources to make these successful.
So as we've said before, consent is obviously something very important. It must be informed, freely given, and mutual. We've talked about how silence is not consent. And that's so critical because oftentimes I'll hear people say, well, they didn't say no. Well, they also didn't say yes. Consent must be informed, freely given, and mutual. Consent can be by words or actions, as long as those words or actions consist of an affirmative, unambiguous, conscious decision by each participant to engage in that mutually agreed upon sexual activity. So in that, some of the keywords there: affirmative, unambiguous, conscious decision. Both sides, or however many parties there are, have to be understanding what's going on and consciously agree to that.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do the impossible and in 4 minutes ask 3 questions, so people hopefully will work to be brief, but the questions I think are very important or have been asked frequently. So the first one is, how does Penn State support survivors? And Stephanie and Yvette are the best to answer this question, but perhaps you can do it the best you can, summarizing the high points.
Sure, thank you for that. Certainly, we want to make sure that survivors and victims don't have to go through this alone. This is a very intimidating, hard process to report to anyone, let alone law enforcement. So please know that this is not something you have to go through alone. We'll work with you step by step. And so there's options available on the law enforcement front. We will investigate, we will document the best we can, but we can also navigate the other systems, not just the criminal justice system. We can navigate through help through student conduct and resources all on this panel to make sure that students and survivors are getting the resources that they need, the academic support, the counseling support through the process. So we want to make sure the students know when you report, you won't do this alone.
I would just add briefly that the Gender Equity Center, as well as CAPS, are both confidential resources. So if a student ever wants to know what are their options, what might something look like, whether it's an educational process or a formal investigation or a criminal process, they can reach out to our office and we will go through those options with them and then help them decide what is best for them.
Okay, we've received a lot of questions about timely warnings by text and email, particularly when they're sent in relationship to the misconduct that's reported. Can we make them more effective? Can they include more details about the suspects and locations of the alleged crime? So Nora, perhaps you could give a brief comment on a student perspective, and then Stephanie in terms of our requirements.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. So I think there's misunderstanding about students about how timely warnings are they're mandated by the Clery Act. So I think the university can do a better job educating students on that. I think it's also not particularly clear to students that they only reflect a very small percentage of the sexual misconduct that occurs on our campus. And that's why campus climate surveys are so important. At the same time, I think that I can absolutely understand how it feels to be triggered and re-traumatized by timely warnings, especially among students who've experienced sexual and relationship violence. I can understand being very frustrated at perceiving a lack of prevention efforts and then concurrently feeling bombarded by timely warning after timely warning. And so I think the university can do more investment in these prevention efforts. Students can't feel safe, or students cannot learn if they do not feel safe. And so if the university does a better job at, one, educating students about the intent, function, and limitations around timely warnings, and also does that investment in prevention efforts around sexual violence, students might feel less threatened by these warnings.
Thanks, Nora, for that perspective. And I will try to answer some of those questions, but really the intent of the timely warning from our perspective is really to notify our community of crimes that are occurring on campus. And those are defined for us mostly through the Clery Act, which are really violent crimes and crimes against people. And when they're reported to us, the timely portion makes a little more challenging because we sometimes don't have all the information that quickly or that soon. There's not the luxury of having a long-term investigation to find those details. Secondly, there are oftentimes third-party reports. And so the information just is not provided to us. Sometimes the victim doesn't feel comfortable giving us the information necessary to put into the timely warning. And more importantly, we want to make sure if we do have some of the information that we're not identifying any factors for the victim or survivor for their safety. So sometimes when the location is vague, that sometimes is intentional. We sometimes don't know, but it's also sometimes intentional to keep those victims and survivors safe. Also, the perpetrator, we don't want to put the victim in any more safety concerns or anxiety around that. And so those are some of the thought processes really quickly behind that. We try to give some tips. We have some feedback also that those tips really aren't pull a lot of weight and aren't extremely helpful, but they're really not in depth. Again, the intent is to get the information out there. We really want those tips on the warnings to just be put those things that you already know to the forefront of your mind. We try to also add a trigger warning at the top of the sexual assault that has a link to some immediate resources. Where I do think we can do better is provide more specific resources within that, and that's something we're working on.
Okay, important question. because a number of people are wondering what happens when sexual assault is reported. How are these cases handled when they occur? And also, are reports confidential, and does Penn State tell the police? How does a report turn into an investigation by OSMPR or Title IX office? So, Stephanie, perhaps you can continue from the last question, and then Suzanne to talk about the Title IX process.
Now, real quickly, the message I want to get to folks is you're not alone through this process. Once it's reported to police, we're going to document all sexual assaults. The investigation will talk through the process of what that investigation looks like on the criminal justice system. And though it seems very overwhelming, it's a step-by-step process. So we'll start with step one, we'll document, get some information, and talk through what the rest of the steps look like. We will notify Office of Student Conduct and the Office of Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response through that process. So we do notify those two offices internally with the university. And as we just spoke about, we often will put out a timely warning.
Suzanne,
Thanks.
just with a minute here to go.
A minute. Okay, so when a report of sexual assault has been made via the Title IX process, the Title IX coordinator receives the report, evaluates that report, determines whether it meets the criteria for Title IX or AD 91, and makes that decision. If it meets the criteria for AD 85, so Title IX program, the coordinator meets with the complainant, has some conversation, determines whether the complainant wishes to move forward and how they wish to move forward. If the complainant wants a formal investigation, then that investigation is launched. At the completion of that investigation, the investigator provides an investigative report or preliminary report to all parties, respondent, complainant, and their advisors. At the end of that, they are allowed to supplement, provide more information. Once the final report is completed, that goes to the Title IX coordinator to determine whether a hearing needs to take place. If a hearing takes place, we have a hearing panel, as Tamla talked about and outlined. The hearing panel hears all evidence from both parties and all witnesses, makes a determination about a finding of whether the respondent is responsible for violating Title IX or not. For student cases, if the respondent is responsible, that case is forwarded to the Office of Student Conduct for necessary disciplinary action. For employees, that case is reported and forwarded to the unit supervisor and their HR strategic partner and the AAO, obviously, to determine appropriate disciplinary sanctions. If the conduct is not Title IX, doesn't fall under the Title IX criteria and is managed under AD 91, there's a similar investigative process. It doesn't have quite every component of the AD 85 process. And those cases are then managed appropriately in the student conduct space and the AAO and HR and unit supervisor space.
Thank you. And I wish that we could have gotten to all of the questions. Some of them are very important, like making the decision to report. But I do want to thank Suzanne and Stephanie, Tamla, Danny, Nora, and Yvette for joining us today to talk about the very critical topic. Of course, we did only scratch the surface today. I didn't manage to get to every question. But for those who are survivors and victims, we encourage reporting and offer a variety of resources to support you. I know that the decision to speak up is difficult. When you're ready, we have a caring and compassionate team who are here to help and guide you through this difficult time. As I said earlier in our discussion, there are no easy solutions to the vexing problem of sexual assault. While we have made progress, it's clear from today's discussion that there are areas that can be improved, and there is much work left for all of us to do. This is a community who cares about each other, and we will continue our efforts together to make Penn State a safe and supporting place for all. Thank you.